In San Jose, California, stands one of the largest and bizarre private residences in the United States, known as the Winchester Mystery House.
There are a lot of architectural oddities that remain a mystery as to why they're here.
This house in California that has been hiding something for over 100 years, something far more uncomfortable than ghosts and curses. The woman who built it was one of the most brilliant people of her era.
The mastermind behind this architectural puzzle was Sarah Winchester. When Sarah's husband died, she became the heir to his massive fortune. She began construction on a mansion that would take 38 years.
And the story told about her for a century was invented by carnival workers 7 months after she died. What was really found inside those walls is something else entirely. The room that was never supposed to be found. In 2015, a man named Walter Magnuson walked into one of America's most famous buildings and noticed something that hundreds of thousands of visitors before him had completely missed. Magnuson was the new general manager of the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California, and on one of his first days on the job, he started asking a very simple question. Why were so many doors locked? What he found over the next 2 years permanently changed how researchers, historians, and the general public understand this building and the woman who built it. By May of 2017, his team had opened 40 previously sealed or forgotten spaces throughout the house. Behind those locked doors were rooms with jewel-colored wallpaper still vibrant after a century of isolation, stained glass windows inexplicably mounted at waist height, and secret balconies that no tour guide had ever described to a visitor. Magnuson told Atlas Obscura directly, "There's very possibly things we haven't discovered yet, just because we don't have blueprints." The single most dramatic find came in 2016, when the preservation team discovered a sealed attic space that had been completely closed off since Sarah Winchester died in September of 1922. They called it the Daisy Room, named after the pattern of daisy flowers pressed into the glass of its windows. The contents of that room stopped the team cold. Sitting inside were a pump organ, a Victorian couch, a dress form, a sewing machine, and several paintings, all arranged as if someone had simply stepped out for a moment and planned to return shortly. The room had been untouched for nearly a century. That discovery pushed the official room count of the house to 161. And it raised a question that nobody in a century of tourism, legend, and Hollywood movies had ever seriously tried to answer. If this house was genuinely the product of a mad woman building randomly to confuse ghosts, then why did every sealed room contain evidence of careful, deliberate purpose? Why was every hidden space designed with intention? The answer to that question is darker, more fascinating, and far more human than any ghost story. And to understand it properly, you first have to understand exactly who Sarah Winchester really was, because almost everything you have ever heard about her is wrong. The most brilliant woman nobody talked about. Here is what the tourist brochures never tell you. The woman who built the Winchester Mystery House was not an uneducated widow who lost her mind to grief. She was one of the most formally educated women in the entire United States during the 1800s. She stood 4 feet 10 inches tall. She spoke Latin, French, Spanish, and Italian fluently by the age of 12. And she had studied mathematics, science, and Shakespeare at an institution directly affiliated with Yale College, at a time when most women were not permitted anywhere near a university. A contemporary of Sarah's, named Merle H. Gray, wrote something remarkable about her that historians have largely ignored for a century. Gray stated, "Perhaps not more than a dozen people in California know that Mrs. Winchester is a musician with a genius for composition, that she is a remarkable businesswoman, that she is a French scholar, that her philanthropies alone would make her a national figure if they were known, that she is a full-fledged architect, familiar with the building peculiarities of all countries." Read that again slowly. A full-fledged architect, familiar with the building peculiarities of all countries. Sarah Lockwood Pardee was born on the 4th of June, 1839, in New Haven, Connecticut. Her father, Leonard, held regular gatherings with prominent abolitionists and freethinkers, and the family openly discussed suffrage, animal rights, and the abolition of slavery at a time when those were radical positions. Sarah grew up in a household where independent thinking was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged. She married William Wirt Winchester on the 30th of September, 1862. William was the son of Oliver Winchester, the man who had built one of the most powerful weapons companies in American history. The Winchester repeating rifle was already becoming legendary by the time Sarah joined the family, described by many as the gun that won the West. The fortune connected to that rifle would define every remaining year of Sarah's life in ways she never anticipated. The tragedies came fast and without mercy. Their daughter Annie was born on the 15th of June, 1866, and died just 6 weeks later on the 24th of July from a severe nutritional deficiency. Sarah never had another child. Her mother died in May of 1880. Her father-in-law, Oliver Winchester, died in December of 1880. And then on the 7th of March, 1881, William himself died of tuberculosis at 43 years old. In 3 years, Sarah lost her mother, her father-in-law, her husband, and her only child. She was 41 years old, she was one of the wealthiest women in the country, and she was completely alone. The inheritance she received is one of the most distorted facts in the entire Winchester legend. Historian Mary Jo Ignofo spent nearly 2 decades researching Sarah's actual financial records, and her findings completely contradict the tourist attraction mythology. The commonly repeated figure of $20 million and $1,000 per day in income was invented by tour guides and promotional materials, not by any document Sarah actually signed. Sarah Winchester was not a woman controlled by grief or guilt or supernatural fear. She was a businesswoman, an investor, a designer, and a builder. When she arrived in California around 1884 and eventually purchased a farmhouse on 45 acres in San Jose in 1886, she was not fleeing ghosts. She was making a calculated real estate decision in a growing region that her physicians had recommended for her worsening rheumatoid arthritis. Before you can understand what the Winchester Mystery House really is, you need to understand exactly how the lie about it was constructed, who built that lie, and why that lie has outlasted the truth for over a century. The lie that carnival workers sold the world. The very first piece of mythology appeared in a San Jose newspaper called The Evening News in 1895. The article described Sarah as a woman who believed she would die when her house was finished, and therefore kept building forever. It was gossip. It was printed without any documentation, without any interview with Sarah herself, and without a single named source. In 1967, a writer named Susie Smith published a book called Prominent American Ghosts. In that book, Smith introduced a specific story that had never appeared in any document before. She claimed that a Boston medium named Adam Coons had told Sarah Winchester that she was cursed by the spirits of everyone killed by Winchester rifles, and that the only way to protect herself was to move west and build continuously. This story has been repeated so often in the decades since that many people today believe it is a documented historical event. It is not. It was invented in a ghost book 45 years after Sarah died. Ignofo tracked down every available record in New Haven and Boston and found no evidence that any medium named Adam Coons or any variation of that name had ever existed. But the most damaging blow to Sarah's reputation came not from journalists or ghost story writers. It came from the carnival workers who purchased her property. Sarah died on the 5th of September, 1922. When appraisers came to value the property, they considered the earthquake-damaged house essentially worthless as real estate. In April of 1923, a man named John Brown and his wife Mamie signed a lease on the property. John Brown was a roller coaster designer. His wife Mamie became the first tour guide. The tourist operation opened on the 30th of June, 1923, with over 10,000 visitors arriving on that first weekend alone. Mamie Brown stood at the front of every tour group and told stories about Sarah Winchester's mental state, her supernatural obsessions, and her desperate attempts to confuse the spirits of the dead. She invented these stories. She had never met Sarah Winchester. The people who had actually known Sarah tried to fight back. Former workers, neighbors, and friends were horrified by what they were reading. They described her to anyone who would listen as clear-headed, financially brilliant, and personally generous. Wikipedia, citing Ignofo's research, records that past neighbors, friends, and workers for Winchester were distressed when they read about superstitious claims being made about the house in Winchester. A carpenter named James Perkins, who had actually worked on the construction, stated explicitly that the more irregular features which made the house famous, including the staircase to nowhere and the doors to walls, were built after Mrs. Winchester's death. Now here is where the story gets genuinely strange, because the house itself contains answers that go far beyond what the ghost story ever explained. When you remove the supernatural mythology and look at the Winchester Mystery House purely as an engineering problem, a completely different picture emerges. This was not random construction. This was a masterpiece of deliberate design. The fortress disguised as a mansion. The innovations Sarah built into her home were decades ahead of their time.
This house, an amazing house, was built by Sarah Lockwood Pardee, who married into the Winchester family. That particular window has 13 blue and gold stones in it. Some were removed during remodeling projects.
The house featured indoor plumbing with both hot and cold running water and a working hot water shower at a period in American history when most wealthy households considered indoor plumbing a luxury. She installed a forced air and steam heating system throughout, alongside 47 fireplaces and 17 chimneys. She built a push-button gas lighting system powered by her own carbide gas generator, which the Winchester Mystery House website describes as truly revolutionary for a private residence of that era. She installed 3 separate elevators, including an Otis electric model that is believed to have been among the first residential elevators on the West Coast. She built an annunciator, which was an early intercom system with a master board in the staff quarters, so that when Sarah pressed a button in any room, a card dropped in the servants' area identifying exactly where she was. She designed a conservatory with automatic watering devices, slanted floors, and trap doors that piped excess water directly to her outdoor gardens, making it one of the earliest documented residential water recycling systems in California. Colin Dickey, the author of Ghostland, who grew up near the house, argued that Sarah could be considered an architectural pioneer of her time, and pointed out that her project was unusual for a woman to look after such a project. That framing matters enormously. A man who supervised a construction project of this complexity for 36 years while incorporating cutting-edge technology would be celebrated as a visionary engineer. Sarah Winchester was dismissed as insane, but the most significant engineering achievement in the entire house has nothing to do with elevators or intercom systems. It has to do with earthquakes. On the 18th of April, 1906, one of the most devastating earthquakes in American history struck the San Francisco Bay Area at an estimated magnitude of 7.9.
A lost piece of Bay Area history unearthed at a flea market and shown for the very first time tonight to the public.
The rare footage of San Francisco following the 1906 earthquake will end up in the Library of Congress.
Before that morning, the Winchester House stood 7 stories tall. The quake destroyed the upper floors, the central tower, and several chimneys, but the core of the structure survived. The house survived because Sarah Winchester had built it with what engineers would later recognize as a compensated foundation, a construction approach in which the structure is not rigidly attached to its brick base, allowing the building to shift and absorb seismic energy rather than fracturing under it. This is the same fundamental principle that underlies modern earthquake-resistant construction. Sarah Winchester applied it to a private residence in the 1880s, decades before earthquake engineering existed as a formal discipline. The house survived the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake as well. The same structure, the same foundation, still standing. The staircases that climb toward ceilings, the doors that open onto blank walls, the hallways that turn without apparent reason, the windows built into floors. Every single one of these features that tour guides have described for a century as signs of madness has a structural and practical explanation that has nothing to do with ghosts. Sarah Winchester house historian Janan Boehm told reporters that Sarah did what was necessary to make the structure safe and watertight. after the earthquake, deliberately choosing not to restore the upper floors to their original height. That was not grief or trauma. That was a calculated architectural decision by a woman who understood her own building. The seance room was never a seance room. Of all the rooms in the Winchester Mystery House, the one that has generated the most mythology is a small, blue-walled chamber that tour guides have called the seance room for over 100 years. The story told to visitors is specific and dramatic. Every night at midnight, the legend goes, a bell tower would ring to summon the spirits of the dead. Sarah Winchester would enter this room and remain there until 2 in the morning, receiving instructions from those spirits about what to build next. The room features 3 separate exits, a cabinet with 13 hooks, and an entrance built at an angle that supposedly confused the ghosts trying to find her. Every element of this story is false. Mary Jo Ignofo spent years tracking down the origin of the seance room mythology and found something remarkable. There are no mentions of a seance room in this house in any document written before a 1928 magazine article, which was published 6 years after Sarah Winchester died. The room itself, according to Ignofo's research, was actually the private office of Sarah's head gardener, a Japanese man named Tommy Nishihara. Joe Nickel, a senior research fellow at the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, who visited the house in October of 2001, confirmed this finding, noting that local historian Ralph Rambo had documented the room being used as a bedroom at various times by her foreman, the chauffeur, the head Japanese gardener, and his wife. Henrietta Sievers, who was Sarah Winchester's personal companion and spent more time in her company than almost anyone else, stated directly that Winchester had no superstitious beliefs of any kind. Former staff members who spent every day in the house confirmed that there is no record of any seances ever being held anywhere on the property. The 13 hooks in the cabinet that tour guides describe as a symbol of Sarah's supernatural obsession. Ignofo stated in a 2013 interview that the 13 hooks were added about 5 years ago, meaning they were installed by the tourist operation around 2008, nearly a century after Sarah died. The bell tower that supposedly rang at midnight to call the spirits, it was used to summon construction workers to their shifts and to serve as a fire alarm. The same function that bell towers served at thousands of other California properties during that era. And the multiple exits from the so-called seance room? The room has 1 entrance and 3 exits, with door handles mounted on only one side, a feature that Ignofo points out was a common design choice in Victorian houses where servants needed to be able to move through a space without disturbing the occupants. It was a practical domestic feature, not a supernatural one. What is genuinely unusual about the Winchester Mystery House is not the seance room. What is genuinely unusual is the acoustic room that tour guides call the Witch's Cap, the only circular room in the entire structure, which features a domed ceiling that amplifies whispers and distorts the sound of voices in ways that seem impossible. Tour guide Susan DeLance noted that the room, for some reason, distorts the sound of your voice in a way that no other room in the house does. That acoustic effect is entirely natural. It is a product of the dome shape, which focuses sound waves toward the center of the room in the same way that the Whispering Gallery in St. Paul's Cathedral in London does. It is remarkable. It is not supernatural. And it is exactly the kind of genuine architectural wonder that gets ignored when the ghost story takes up all the oxygen in the room. The hidden life of a hidden woman. When the safe hidden in the Winchester Mystery House was finally opened after Sarah's death, the people expecting gold plates and spirit message tablets found something far more human. Inside the safe was a lock of hair from her daughter Annie, who had died after 6 weeks of life. Baby shoes that had never been worn long enough to be broken in. A lock of hair from her husband, William. Their death certificates. That was it. The locked safe of a woman dismissed as obsessed with the supernatural contained only the most universal of human things, proof that she had loved people and lost them. But Sarah Winchester's private life contained something else entirely, something that the ghost mythology almost successfully buried forever. She was one of the most significant philanthropists in late 19th century American history, and almost nobody who visited her house in the 100 years after her death ever heard that fact mentioned on a tour. In November of 1909, Sarah Winchester wrote a letter to the General Hospital Society of Connecticut. She told them she intended to fund a memorial to her late husband, William. The following month, she sent a check for $300,000. Over the next decade, she donated what historians estimate as over $1 million to that project, equivalent to roughly $15 million in today's money. The hospital she funded opened on the 4th of April, 1918, in West Haven, Connecticut. It was dedicated entirely to the treatment of tuberculosis, the disease that had killed William. That hospital did not disappear after Sarah died. It was incorporated into Yale School of Medicine in 1948. It operates today as the Winchester Center for Lung Disease at Yale New Haven Hospital and the Winchester Chest Clinic. Yale Medicine's own website describes the center's history as dating back more than a century, when it was set up through a bequest from Sarah Winchester in memory of her husband. A woman who was told to tour guests for a century was haunted by guilt over the lives her family's weapons had taken, actually spent over $1 million saving the lives of people dying from the same disease that killed her husband. Her philanthropy did not stop at Connecticut. She was one of the first major donors to the Sempervirens Club, the organization that launched what would become the Save the Redwoods campaign in California. She donated to the San Jose Relief Fund after the 1906 earthquake struck her own community. She employed hundreds of workers from American, Dutch, Italian, Irish, Chinese, and Japanese backgrounds, paying them $3 per day at a time when the standard daily wage for construction laborers was $1. She purchased homes for longtime employees. She named several of them in her will. Former workers named their children after her. Bruce Spoon, a San Jose State University historian who wrote a master's thesis on Sarah Winchester in 1951 and interviewed former employees and contractors who had actually worked on the house, concluded that Sarah had two primary motivations for her continuous construction. She genuinely enjoyed architecture as a creative outlet, and she wanted to provide sustained employment to workers who needed income during the economic downturns of the late Victorian era. The house historian Janan Boima told reporters she would give to causes that were dear to her, and she'd usually do it anonymously. Sarah's attorney, Frank Lieb, and her niece, Marion Merriman, handled most of her charitable giving, and the full scope of her donations was not known until her estate was processed after her death. The Mill Valley Record published an unsigned editorial in 1922 that read, "A few days ago, a quiet woman went quietly out of life, leaving a fortune of some millions, all of it for philanthropy." A quiet woman. That phrase captures something essential about why history treated Sarah Winchester the way it did. She was not loud about her accomplishments. She was not loud about her intelligence. She was not loud about her giving. She moved through the world with the kind of deliberate quietness that the Victorian era expected from wealthy women, and that quietness made her an easy target for the carnival workers who arrived months after her death and started building a tourist empire on lies. Here is the real mystery of the Winchester Mystery House. Not who built it, not why. The real mystery is how a woman this remarkable got erased so completely, and what that erasure reveals about how history treats people who do not fit the stories we want to tell about them. What the walls have been trying to tell us. Sarah Winchester was described during her lifetime as a woman of extraordinary intelligence, financial skill, and personal generosity by people who actually knew her. She founded a hospital that saves lives today. She employed hundreds of workers at wages that were considered remarkable for the era. She built a structure that survived two major earthquakes using engineering principles that would not become standard practice for decades. She was fluent in 4 languages, studied mathematics and science at an institution affiliated with Yale, and personally supervised one of the largest and most technically complex private construction projects in California history. And history remembered her as a crazy widow who was afraid of ghosts. The academic community has spent the last decade and a half systematically dismantling the mythology. Christine R. Junker, a PhD from Michigan State, who published a peer-reviewed paper on Sarah Winchester in the journal Home Cultures in 2015, argued that the mythology around the house reveals a great deal about the anxieties and preoccupations regarding class, gender, and domesticity, and obscures the more interesting aspects of this architectural project. Junker was pointing at something that Colin Dickey had expressed more bluntly in a different context. She was the 1%, and the city resented her for it, and so it punished her through gossip and myth. The University of Wyoming Firearms Research Center published a direct reassessment of Sarah's legacy in October of 2023, stating, "Unfortunately, her legacy has been reduced to nothing more than a ghost story connected to a quirky house in San Jose. Her real story, however, is that of a brilliant, charitable woman whose life was marred by tragedy and forever tarnished by gossip mongers and tabloid drama." The process by which the myth replaced the reality followed a clear pattern. First came the 1895 newspaper gossip that called her superstitious without a single source. Then came the claim that she was a snob, that she was afraid of death, that she was a spiritualist. Then came the 1906 earthquake, after which the newspapers decided she was mad. Then came the 1923 carnival workers, who turned the madness into a business model. Then came the 1929 magazine that invented the 13 mythology. Then came the 1967 ghost book that invented the medium that never existed. Layer by layer, over 7 decades, a real woman was buried under a fictional character. Mary Jo Ignoffo, whose biography is the most thorough historical examination of Sarah Winchester ever published, summed it up simply: "I feel she's really had a bum rap." And in a 2025 updated edition of her book, Ignoffo added, "My hope is that audiences will reconsider how quickly we label someone as crazy or subversive." The Winchester Mystery House is still open to visitors today. It still offers ghost tours. The gift shop still sells books about the spirits that Sarah supposedly summoned in the Blue Room. The 13 hooks are still mounted in the cabinet of the room that was actually a gardener's office. The mythology is still generating revenue for the descendants of the carnival workers who invented it over 100 years ago. But something is changing. Walter Magnuson and his team are still opening locked spaces, still finding rooms that should not exist, still discovering evidence of a mind that was building with purpose rather than panic. The architectural investigation that is slowly revealing the true design logic of the house is not complete.
The Winchester Mystery House has attracted visitors for decades, including this recently discovered attic space. The home has 161 rooms, 10,000 windows.
Magnuson himself acknowledged that with no blueprints and over 160 confirmed rooms, there are very possibly spaces inside that structure that no living person has seen. And somewhere in those walls, in the acoustic curves of the witch's cap and the stained glass windows that quote Shakespeare, and the earthquake-resistant foundation that has been absorbing California's tremors for over 130 years, the real story of Sarah Winchester is waiting. Not the ghost story, not the mad widow, not the woman who was afraid of the dead. The story of a 4-foot 10-inch woman who spoke 4 languages, built a hospital that still operates at Yale, employed hundreds of workers at triple the going wage, engineered structures that have outlasted a century of earthquakes, and did almost all of it quietly, anonymously, in ways that the world was never supposed to notice. The story of a woman who was not building to escape anything. She was simply building because she was extraordinary, and because nobody in her era had given her anywhere else to put it. The real mystery of the Winchester Mystery House was never what was inside the walls. The real mystery was why it took us over 100 years to look. If this story made you see Sarah Winchester differently from how you did before, drop your thoughts in the comments below and tell us what part of her real history surprised you the most.